started the normal sound of a bomb dropping, and then it developed into just like the roar of an express train, and in the split second, you knew it was you.
And I always remembered that my father said, if you were ever going to, in a blitz or anything, cover your head. So I remember doing that, and that's all I remember.
The noise was ferocious. I always remember the noise of it must have been the bombs whistling down. They seemed to whistle, and then there was a kind of a pause, and then bang.
We'd have fought them with knives and forks, if necessary, on the beaches. And we know now, perhaps, although you still feel the same, we felt that we would beat them. They could do what they liked, but we would beat them, even if we had nothing, that they would not invade our land. I know it's ridiculous, but that's how we felt. Everything was going, cinemas, churches, municipal buildings, the Guildhall, you name it, everything had been hit.
Houses were burning, shops were burning, and it was a proper inferno right the way through. And I suppose there was only about 50 or 60 people at least in that shelter. And when I got there, we couldn't do a thing for them. They were literally blown to pieces. There was nothing left, just a shell of a shelter, that was all. And the next morning you came down, there were pieces in the trees and clothing and everything else. We never got one person out of it. They were all killed.
There was nothing to go along afterwards to see, after a raid there in the street, a boot with just a little bit of sock hanging out of it, and the sinews there, somebody's foot.
I remember bringing out one fellow. He'd lost half his face, and down one side his arm was gone, his leg was gone, and he looked up at me and he said, "Have you got a cigarette, mate?" And I gave him a cigarette and lit it for him, put him in his lips, and he just took a couple of puffs and he said, "Will you tell my landlady I shall not be home to tea?" And with that he closed his eyes and was gone.
This was a very difficult job indeed, especially at night in the darkness, because we weren't supposed to use lights, and if there were any lights, there were only 10 torches, because lights attracted further bombing from the Germans.
And I thought, the sheets, the clothes are awful tight somehow, and I went to turn and couldn't. And then I pulled at the clothes, as I thought, and it was stones and rubble that was in my hands, and it was very hot.
It was very, very hard to breathe. I remember that. It was short breaths that you took, and when you get tired doing that, and you took a deep breath, then, you get a terrific pain.
And I heard a man saying to Father White, "Father, we're going to break our legs if we pull at them like this." And I always remember his answer. He said, "Well, if she's to come out without her legs, she'll have to do that, because otherwise they'll burn." Well, that remark sort of shot me into action. It dawned on me then what had happened, and I started to sort of try and free myself and move my legs as much as I could.
I was pulled out backwards in my face, and actually I thought I was in the dustbin. That was what went through my head, what am I doing in the dustbin? Because it just looked grey ash to me, that you would get out of a coal fire.
They tied a rope all round about me, and they seemed to be away up high somewhere, and they pulled, and at last I found myself dangling in the air, and I was out.
The raid should have gone on for hours. They should have totally destroyed London that night, but they didn't. They stopped.
They were all put in the back of a furniture van. It looked like cattle. It looked like that they were going to a cinema because the mortuaries couldn't cope with the fatal injuries. They were placed in a cinema, and to see this, it was dreadful. It really was dreadful.
Every night you got bombed, and then you could hear all the houses being blown up and the glass going in the windows, and you could hear all the people in the next shelters screaming because they was frightened.
And I'll always remember a friend of mine, Irene, her name being on the list. You know, and this still sticks with me, you know. And going along there and looking and actually seeing just nothing but rubble. I just can't explain how I felt. I just can't explain.
You could see the wardrobe and all the clothes in it from the road. And I saw him up there helping himself and tucking all his stuff into a sack. So I went up and arrested him. And that was a frequent thing, looting in that way. You wouldn't think people would be so despicable as to do a thing. That was a house where 3 people were killed and he was looting their stuff.
And sitting in the ditches anywhere to get away from Hull. Because when we got that blitz, it was really terrible. There was buildings down and houses down and people lost their children and their families. It was really terrible. It was a wicked time.
And people simply walked along the main roads and were picked out by buses or by cars and so on, coaches, and were taken out of the city.
Pillowcases over our shoulder, my mother, my father, my sister and I, and the people around Hillhead subway station looking at us in amazement, although they only stayed 4 or 5 miles away, although they had seen the flames, I don't think they appreciated exactly what had happened, and we looked like refugees or tinkers arriving from a Holocaust, I think.